Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to thank the organizers of the conclave for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Despite the undeniable advances of conventional medicine and scientific medicine in the past 100 years, we are now headed for a global crisis of healthcare. And I think that unless we come to solve this, it has the potential to sink us all and disrupt all of the economic growth that we see in many places. The good news is I think there are solutions to this crisis, but they require out-of-the-box thinking, the development of new paradigms of medicine and of healthcare. And at the moment, I don't see too much of that. But I also want to give you a message today that I think India may be in a very unique position to be the place where these new models can develop and can be demonstrated. The basic problem is that allopathic medicine has become much too expensive to deliver to the people who need it. So the first question is, why has medicine become so expensive? Why are these costs spiraling out of control? I think there are several reasons for this. Some of them are beyond our control, and some of them, ironically, have to do with the very successes of scientific medicine. By rolling back acute infectious illness as the primary cause of premature disability and death in the early part of the 20th century, we left ourselves with chronic degenerative illness. And that, by nature, is much more difficult to reverse or treat, much more expensive to intervene in. So we've changed the nature of illness to make it much more difficult for ourselves. We have also, through medical advances, enabled people to live longer. And that is a mixed blessing because the greatest healthcare expenses are incurred in the latter years of life. The fact is that in many parts of the world today, especially in the developed nations, the oldest old are the fastest growing segment of the population. Actually, centenarians in many parts of the world are the fastest growing segment of the human population. You know, much has been written about this. In countries like the US, in Japan, we are witnessing an unprecedented demographic change. Never before in human history will such a large percentage of the population be in the ranks of the old and the oldest old. This has enormous political, economic, and social consequences. But one of them, a very immediate one of them, is that it's going to cause an enormous escalation in healthcare costs. Now, I can tell you from my vantage point in the United States, our healthcare system is already on the verge of total collapse. I think many people there are feeling that, but have no idea of the implications of it, and have no sense of how complete and total that collapse is going to be. I mean, already in my country, many hospitals are going bankrupt, especially smaller and community hospitals. And one can envision a time in the not-distant future when large areas of the country will be left with only one central hospital, which is the only one that will be able to afford all of the technological hardware and scientific advances. And a lot of the other service centers simply won't be there anymore. Healthcare costs have risen so much that they are now crippling U.S. corporations. A year ago, the CEO of General Motors in a speech said that U.S. corporations were now unable to compete effectively in international markets because they were crippled by healthcare costs at home. You know, where is this going? And if this is the situation now, imagine what happens when the baby boomers, this huge population bulge, which is just entering the ranks of senior years, hits those years when they develop the diseases of aging and become an even greater burden on the healthcare system. And then if you look at the other end of the age spectrum, you see this generation of fat kids that we're raising in America and elsewhere. Morbid obesity has now begun to develop at ages as young as 2 and 3 in certain subpopulations. This is being followed closely by an epidemic of type 2 diabetes. And diabetes experts tell us that the health consequences, especially the cardiovascular consequences of type 2 diabetes, develop on average 10 to 15 years after diagnosis. That means we can expect to see an epidemic of coronary heart disease in men in their late 20s and early 30s, something we've never seen before. Actually, that's already started to happen. A friend of mine who is an internist who's in my program in integrative medicine now tells me that a rule that he always operated by was that if a young man comes to an emergency room with acute chest pain, that you never had to think of doing an extensive workup because the chance that this was anything serious was negligible. He says, now you have to consider the possibility that this is a heart attack. So this is an entirely new kind of disease in a different population than we've ever seen before. So the combination of these two things, that is a generation of unhealthy kids, and experts tell us that this may be the first generation of American kids who will not live as long as their parents because of the rise of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and the implications of that. And at the other end, this enormous population bulge of old people is surely going to sink the system. Also, consider the fact that the United States, the richest country in the world, which spends more per capita on health care than any other country by an enormous margin, has the worst health outcomes of any of the developed nations. So we are spending more per capita by a huge margin than any of the other NATO countries, and by any measure of health outcomes, whether it's infant mortality, longevity, we are at the bottom. What's wrong with that picture? And in addition, over 40% of our population is uninsured and has no access to these great advances in scientific medicine that we've heard about. It seems to me that what's wrong with that picture very clearly is that we're spending our money in the wrong ways. And I think the lesson to be learned from the experience in the United States applies elsewhere as well. The basic problem is that we are not spending money on the promotion of health. We are spending money on the intervention of established disease, and that's a losing proposition. You know, we need to spend money in ways that incentivize people and educate them about living according to principles that enhance health and protect health. It is quite true that the diseases that now absorb most of our healthcare dollars are diseases of lifestyle. But how are we teaching kids about adopting healthy lifestyles? This should be the highest priority in education. At youngest ages possible, we should begin to teach kids about how to eat properly, about how to maintain habits of physical activity that will last them throughout life, about how to practice simple methods of neutralizing the harmful effects of stress. I don't see any of this being done. And in almost every area of healthcare that I look at, the priorities seem to me exactly 180 degrees off from where they should be. I'll give you one very dramatic example of what I mean, but I think this is symbolic of the general problem. About a year and a half ago, the New York Times ran a very detailed and good four-part series on the type 2 diabetes epidemic in New York and the economic implications of it particularly. This is a devastating epidemic of disease in that population. And kids of very young ages are affected. The article pointed out that especially immigrant children are very much affected, especially Asian kids. And interestingly, East Asian kids, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, are susceptible to type 2 diabetes at much lower weights than other ethnic groups. So often they develop this disease before the development of morbid obesity, simply by switching to a mainstream American diet high in processed food and fast food. One of the articles looked at did an economic analysis of type 2 diabetes and pointed out that in the past couple of years, many diabetes treatment centers and clinics had gone out of business. There was a very disturbing chart printed that looked at the costs and profits made in the treatment and care of type 2 diabetes. And the article showed that for every preventive nutritional consultation that was done, for every preventive eye consultation, for every preventive foot consultation, these clinics and centers lost on an average of $140. For every amputation of a diabetic limb, they made $6,000. So how can it be otherwise? This is the way the whole system is set up. There is no reimbursement for a physician to sit with a patient and counsel them about how to eat, or to teach them simple stress reduction exercises. There is every financial incentive to order tests, to do diagnostic procedures, to use interventions, to prescribe drugs, all of the things that are expensive. And I think the other problem, and why I say a new paradigm is necessary, is that modern allopathic medicine has become much too dependent on technology. And that technology is inherently expensive. There is no way around that problem. If all of our thinking in terms of intervening in disease is based on high-tech solutions, then we are paying bills that are never going to go down. And the problem here is that physicians and other ancillary health personnel are simply not trained in simpler, low-tech, low-cost methods of intervention, often methods which have existed in other cultures at other times, which have worked very well for people in other parts of the world. They simply are not taught this in medical school. A glaring omission is that basic nutrition is still not taught in medical schools. The total instruction I got in nutrition in 4 years at Harvard Medical School and a year of internship was 30 minutes, which were grudgingly allowed to a dietitian in one hospital I worked at in Boston to tell us about special diets we could order for patients. That has not changed substantially since I've been out of medical school. And even when schools say they teach nutrition, when I look at what they teach, it's really biochemistry, and it's buried in biochemistry courses, and it's forgotten as soon as biochemistry exams are taken. And there are tremendous consequences of this ignorance. One of them is that in the US now, over 40% of our hospitals have fast food restaurants on their premises. This is the food service provided in the hospital. I mean, what kind of an example are we setting for people by that? And there's complete complacency about this. This is seen as a good financial deal for the hospital. Nobody sees the absurdity of offering this kind of food in a medical setting. In addition, I think that the nutritional illiteracy of the medical profession allows the pressures of corporations that make food and the stupidity of governments that should be doing something in this area to just run rampant over good sense. If the medical profession were literate about nutrition, it could stand up as a potent social and political counterweight to those pressures. Again, let me just give you an example of what I mean. A couple of years ago, I was asked to be a keynote speaker at a much publicized summit on the obesity crisis in America that was sponsored by Time Magazine and ABC News. And I was very offended at many things that I heard there. For one thing, the federal government was pushing very hard the line that obesity is purely a matter of individual responsibility. This was then our then Secretary of Health and Human Services said that the solution was for Americans to do sit-ups in front of the television. There was also a panel that I sat there through had the major PR people for Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Nestle, and a couple of other companies. To listen to them, you would have thought these were health food corporations. And their position is that they are just giving people what they want. They see no responsibility on their part to try to shape tastes or to move tastes in better directions. Now, how can the federal government in our country say that its hands are clean when if you go to a supermarket in America, the cheapest calories that you can buy are all of the low-quality carbohydrate foods, all of the snack foods made with pro-inflammatory fats like refined soy oil, for example, and products sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, both very suspect culprits in the obesity epidemic. And the reason those are cheap is because there are federal government subsidies which artificially depress the prices of those crops. Whereas the most expensive calories you can buy are fruits and vegetables because there are no federal subsidies to those crops. So it's stacked completely unfairly against consumers. You know, this is not a matter of individual responsibility. It's a matter of collective responsibility. And unless all sectors of society, individuals, corporations, and government pull together in the same direction, I think we're doomed nutritionally. We are heading for very clear disaster. And this is disaster not only in the health sense, but disaster in the economic sense that has huge implications. Now, for the past 35 years, I have been working to develop a new paradigm of medicine and healthcare. I have promoted and used the name of integrative medicine. And let me just define for you what this is. The short answer is that integrative medicine is the intelligent combination of ideas and practices of conventional medicine and alternative medicine. I don't much like the term alternative medicine. It suggests that we're trying to do things in place of standard medicine, and that has never been my idea. integrative medicine begins with the recognition that conventional medicine does some things extremely well, and that should always be the first thing you think of when dealing with a serious medical condition. I often say that if I were in a serious automobile accident, I wouldn't want to first be taken to a practitioner of Ayurveda or acupuncture or shamanism. I would love to go to a high-level trauma center and get put back together, but then as soon as I could, I might use other methods that I know about to speed up the healing process. I mean, if I have an acute bacterial pneumonia, I would want to be treated with antibiotics. That seems to me obvious. But it's astonishing how infrequently patients and doctors make those distinctions. In general, allopathic medicine has become more and more specialized and effective at dealing with critical situations, with very serious disease, with disease involving vital organs, with disease that's moving very rapidly. In those instances, it is appropriate to use allopathic methods first, but even then, I think it is very useful to combine them with other methods that can moderate the toxicity of allopathic interventions, particularly pharmaceutical drugs, as well as support the body's own defenses and healing functions. But in many other kinds of illness, and especially the diseases of lifestyle, many of the chronic degenerative illnesses, allopathic medicine is much less effective. And there, the balance of judging benefits versus risks does not come out so favorably. And in those instances, it seems to me, especially if there's time to wait, it is certainly worth trying interventions that are simpler, cheaper, more natural, that may take longer to work, that may be less dramatic in their effects, but that over time can produce as good or better results. And I also don't like much the term complementary medicine, which has become popular in many parts of the world. That sounds much too polite to me and suggests that what you're trying to do is to keep allopathic medicine as the centerpiece and have little garnishes around it. In fact, much of what I see that goes on in the name of integrative medicine today or holistic medicine is really complementary. It's adding things to an allopathic centerpiece. And that is not my idea either. To me, integrative medicine means a true marriage. It's really an inclusive system that draws on the best aspects, the best ideas and practices of all systems that are out there. But I think integrative medicine is much more than simply bringing new therapies into the mainstream. I mean, I think that's great, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But our integrative medicine movement, which is quite strong now in the US and in other parts of the world, really has larger purposes. One of them is to restore the focus of medicine on health and healing and away from disease and the management of symptoms. I think this is one of the most apt criticisms of conventional medicine. It is entirely focused on disease once it's established and management of symptoms. And I think this, given the health crisis that's engulfing us, the aspect of integrative medicine that really is health promoting stands out. Secondly, integrative medicine insists that people are more than physical bodies, that we are also mental, emotional beings, spiritual entities, community members, and these other aspects of human life are very relevant to understanding health and illness. And unless medicine takes those into account, it has cut itself off from large areas of intervention in which many kinds of disease can be modified, often through relatively simple, low-cost techniques, particularly in the area of mind-body medicine, which is now very well researched and has a very good scientific foundation to it. You may know, you may have read that, for example, in the past few years, we have new techniques of brain imaging, like functional MRIs and PET scans, that enable us to visualize living brains. And this has totally changed the approach to mind-body medicine. Things that would have been dismissed easily as mystical a few years ago, states of consciousness, for example, or the changes that happen in people through meditation practice, can now be correlated with actual tangible changes in brain function. This has put this whole area of mind-body medicine on a totally new footing. Integrative medicine also insists that we look at all aspects of lifestyle in understanding health and illness. That means inquiring about how people eat, how they exercise or don't, how they rest and sleep, what they do for fun, the nature of their relationships. All of this, how they handle stress, all of this is relevant to the equation of health and illness. And again, by inquiring in these areas, it's often possible to see ways in which you can intervene to change people's lifestyle at much lower cost and risk than simply prescribing drugs. And finally, integrative medicine insists that the interaction between a doctor and a patient is very relevant to the healing process. One of the great tragedies that's happened in my country, where medicine has become a for-profit system taken over by corporations, is that the amount of time that doctors have to spend with patients has been cut to the point where it's almost impossible for this kind of productive healing relationship to form. If you've got 5 or 7 minutes with a patient, it's probably not impossible, but it's very unlikely that you can form the kind of relationship that can foster healing. In some countries like Japan, this is even worse, where doctors now typically see 30 patients an hour and are called 2-minute doctors. Completely, and not only has this made things much the worse for patients, it has also made things very difficult for physicians, because throughout history, the relationship with a patient, which in many cultures has been considered sacred, has been the source of greatest emotional satisfaction in practicing medicine. So in the contemporary world, in many places, the destruction of this by the systems of healthcare that have enveloped medicine are responsible for growing unhappiness and frustration of physicians as well as of patients. And I think this is one reason why many doctors come to us, for example, at the University of Arizona for the kind of training that we offer. Now, finally, and this is what integrative medicine is most known for, is this idea of bringing other therapies into the mainstream. And this is interesting. The hostility and resistance of many mainstream physicians to ideas and practices that come from out there is very interesting to watch. This is always rationalized in terms that these things have no scientific basis, that they're unproven, that they're potentially dangerous. Now, in one sense, this is people in glass houses throwing stones, because a great deal of conventional medical therapy does not have a solid scientific basis either. And the methods of allopathic medicine, because they're stronger, are much more productive of harm. The former dean of the University of Arizona College of Medicine, Jim Dolan, a very eminent cardiologist who for years was editor-in-chief of the Archives of Internal Medicine, was a great supporter of our program, and without him it would never have been founded and developed, said on his retirement, first of all, that his greatest achievement that he was most proud of was setting up this program. But he also said that one of the things that he learned was that how physicians and scientists react to new information, to unfamiliar information, is more a function of the source of the information than the content. That if information comes from an unfamiliar source, there is an instinctive, reflexive resistance to it. An example that he liked to use from his own field was the incredible amount of time, almost 4 decades, it took for doctors, cardiologists in particular, to realize that aspirin was a very useful remedy to thin the blood and prevent heart attacks. This was an observation first made in the 1950s by a general practitioner in Southern California who noted this was the era when all kids in America had their tonsils taken out. You couldn't make it to adolescence with your tonsils in those days. And it was common to give kids after the operation a product called Aspergum to chew, which was an aspirin preparation. And this doctor noticed that the kids who chewed Aspergum had bleeding in their throats longer than kids who didn't chew Aspergum. And it occurred to him that maybe aspirin had an anticoagulant property. So he started taking aspirin himself and noticed that when he cut himself shaving, that it bled longer. He wrote a paper in a journal of general practice proposing that aspirin was a blood-thinning medication and might have utility in reducing risk of heart attacks. It took 40 years for the conventional medical and cardiology community to accept that, and the reason for the resistance was that this came from a general practitioner and was published in a journal that cardiologists didn't read. Now imagine when this information comes from something much farther afield. For example, somebody talking about the virtues of Chinese medicine or a plant that grows in the Amazon, that there is this instinctive resistance. What I teach the physicians and students who come through my program is that it would be very useful to get in the habit of using a sliding scale of evidence that works this way. The greater the potential of a treatment to cause harm, the stricter the standards of evidence it should be held to for efficacy. I think that makes a great deal of sense and would enable us to cut through a lot of the confusion out there. There's so many therapies, there's so many things out there. We don't have time to assess them all through randomized controlled trials. But I think that this way of thinking, that the more potential harm a treatment can cause, that's when you want to hold it to stricter standards of scientific evidence. If we adopted that principle religiously in conventional medicine, I think we would have saved ourselves a lot of trouble and saved patients a lot of toxicity. Now, let me just tell you that in the US, integrative medicine is now a very established movement. There is a group that I helped found called the Consortium of Academic Health Centers for Integrative Medicine. We now have 35 member medical schools in the US and Canada, and these are leading medical schools. It's Harvard, Georgetown, Duke, UC San Francisco, UCLA, and so forth. And its involvement at levels of deans and chancellors who recognize that medical education, medical research, and medical practice have to move in this direction. This integrative medicine movement is also very strong in Scandinavia. It's strong in China. It is happening in Japan. You can see it beginning to happen all over. I feel very strongly that integrative medicine is the way of the future. Not only is it the kind of medicine that patients want, and patients are very clear about that they want doctors who can spend time with them, who can understand them, who will not just look at them as physical bodies, who won't just tell them that the only way to deal with your problem is take these drugs, who are open to ideas about questions about other forms of medicine, who can give you advice about how to shop in a health food store, about how to eat, about how to use dietary supplements. Patients are very clear about that. Increasingly, it is the kind of medicine that physicians want to practice because, as I said, so many of them find the exclusive practice of interventionist allopathic medicine to be unsatisfying. But I think more important, integrative medicine makes economic sense. It has the potential of lowering healthcare costs while preserving outcomes because it can bring lower cost treatments into the mainstream that are safe and effective. I'll give you one example, and this is relevant to where we are today. I have become known as one of the few physicians who promotes breath work, who teaches patients and doctors to use breathing as a primary therapy. I learned none of this in medical school. I learned about this from two sources. The first was from studying yoga, because one division of yoga, pranayama, is about breathing. And the second was from working with old osteopathic physicians, doctors who use this system of manipulation of the body by hands, and some of whom place a great deal of emphasis on breathing patterns. From those two sources, I learned information about the practical use of breath control to affect physiology. There has been very, very little research on breathing, certainly in the Western world. There's been a little bit in India, but it is basically an unresearched subject. So here is something that you could say has no scientific basis, and yet I think the harmfulness potential here is extremely low. So this is certainly something I'm willing to experiment with while encouraging people to do the necessary research. But this is a plausible therapy. The basic theory of breath work is that breathing is the only function of the body that you can do completely consciously or completely unconsciously. It can be a totally voluntary act or a totally involuntary act. Actually, there's one other function like that, eye blink, but I don't know of anybody who's made use of eye blink as a therapeutic method. Breathing is controlled by two different sets of nerves, by the involuntary nerves and the voluntary nerves. The theory of breath work is that by imposing rhythms on breathing with the voluntary system, you gradually induce these rhythms in the involuntary system, the autonomic nervous system, and thereby can influence the function of all internal organs, of circulation, of heart rate, of digestion, and so forth. And in general, the diseases that result from disturbances in these systems, high blood pressure, heart arrhythmias, for example, many kinds of chronic digestive disorders, are not conditions that allopathic medicine treats effectively. I regularly teach a very simple, relaxing breath, a pranayama breath, that takes all of about 30 seconds to do to patients that I work with. And over the years, I think of all of the recommendations that I've given to patients, this is the one that I've gotten the most positive feedback about. I have met people who've lowered high blood pressure using this, people who have corrected conditions like irritable bowel syndrome, people whose hands have been cold all their lives, whose hands are now warm. I now have, I think, 4 well-documented cases of people who've stopped atrial fibrillation just using this breathing technique, something I wouldn't have thought was possible. That's usually a heart arrhythmia that requires more drastic intervention. So here is a method that's completely free. It uses no equipment. It's incredibly time efficient. It has everything to recommend it. First of all, why aren't people studying this? I think the answer is it's just too simple. It seems too simple. It's not taken seriously in an age when we are fascinated by high-tech solutions to everything. And this is just one example of something that's out there in the world beyond conventional medicine that, if brought into the mainstream, just think what this could do in terms of numbers of prescriptions that would not have to be written, of drug toxicity that could be ended, of conditions that had plagued people that could be easily stopped. This is just one example of the many, many things that exist in the world, as I said, often in other systems of medicine and other traditions of medicine that are not currently taught in conventional schools of medicine, that allopathic physicians are unaware of because they haven't been taught about them, that if we brought it into the mainstream could improve outcomes and lower costs. Now, I'm fascinated, I used the breath work deliberately because this is something that comes from an ancient tradition here in India. I think for me, India, I first came to India in 1959, and I've made a number of visits here since. Increasingly, I've had a number of physicians from India who've come to study with me at the University of Arizona. And I'm fascinated by India because it's a unique example in the world of a country in which a number of different traditional medical systems have had long, illustrious histories and are currently actively taught. And there is even attempt now at federal regulation of these different systems and setting standards for them. At the moment, these systems, although there is, you can access Ayurvedic preparations, homeopathic preparations in many Indian pharmacies, I think the integration of these systems has not really happened here, but there's potential for that. And I think there's greater potential here than there is anywhere else that I know of. In China today, I think this is interesting. In all big Chinese cities and big hospitals, cancer patients get both types of medicine. They get chemotherapy, radiation surgery, and they get Chinese herbal medicine and acupuncture. And the Chinese experience is that this combination improves outcomes, enables doctors to use lower doses of chemotherapy, lower doses of radiation, that they're better side effect profiles. I mean, this is an example. In the West, where I live, it's the very, very exceptional cancer patient who is able to use both of these kinds of worlds simultaneously. But I think in India, there's an even greater potential to do this. And as I said, I firmly believe this is the future. I think that as the healthcare crisis deepens, the economic pressures to find a way of lowering healthcare costs are going to increase enormously. And as that happens, I think the wisdom of the integrative approach will become apparent. And I can absolutely envision that it is in this country, and this country first, that models of integrative medicine can be developed both for inpatient and outpatient care that might serve as models that can be replicated around the world. And I think this would be a fantastic contribution of your country to medicine and healthcare. Before I conclude, let me just say a word about, you talked a lot about longevity and living longer and living well. My most recent book was called Healthy Aging, and it was an exploration of some of these questions. And let me just give you a quick summary of my thinking in this area. In my country at the moment, there is a tremendous obsession with anti-aging. There is even a great growth of a specialty called anti-aging medicine. We have an American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine that now has thousands of physician members. I went to one of they hold enormous annual conventions in Las Vegas, appropriately, and I went to one of them as undercover as I could a few years ago to see what went on there. It's an interesting mix. There are some material in anti-aging medicine and some practices that make sense to me, especially reasonable information about diet and use of dietary supplements. But it's all mixed up with things that seem very silly to me, like a tremendous emphasis on cosmetic surgery, for example, and appearance. And the people who founded this American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine came from the world of competitive bodybuilding. So their vision of what it is to be a healthy old person is to be a senior bodybuilder. And I think that's rather foolish. Also, the products and services recommended under the banner of anti-aging medicine in general have very little scientific evidence to support them. These are often expensive interventions. Some of them, I think, are potentially dangerous, especially use of hormonal therapies. But most of all, the very concept of anti-aging bothers me. Aging is a universal process. Everything in the universe ages. Animals age, plants age, mountains age, stars age. If everything in the universe ages, if this is written into the laws of the universe, then to set your goal as anti-aging means to put yourself in a very wrong relationship with nature, and that's not a good place to be. If anti-aging is not, I personally, having reviewed all the science in this area, I don't think it's possible to stop the aging process or to reverse the aging process. If anti-aging is not a legitimate goal, then what is? I've called it healthy aging, and that means focusing on maintaining health as you go through life, so that at any age you have the energy and the capability of enjoying life, of meeting its demands, and so forth. All of us at some point will get sick and die. If we look at aging in our populations, we see that as people get older, and especially as they pass the age of 60, large categories of disease become more frequent. The big ones are cardiovascular disease, cancer, and neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. So these are called the age-related diseases. The question that I asked in this book is, are these diseases necessary consequences of aging? Are these aspects of the aging process? And there I think the answer clearly is no, that it is possible to separate aging from age-related disease. And therefore, the legitimate goal seems to me to work towards reducing the risk and delaying the onset of these diseases, which currently shorten lives prematurely and make the latter part of life unpleasant and unsatisfying for so many people. There's a technical term for this strategy. I didn't invent it. It's been in the medical literature, but I've been trying to popularize it. It's called compression of morbidity, a lovely term where morbidity has the medical meaning of sickness. So the idea is that you're trying to squeeze the time of disability and decline at the end of life into as short a period as possible. So the idea is to live long and well and then have a rapid drop-off at the end. I think that's what we'd all like to do. There are examples of this. There was a wonderful story that circulated in the States some months ago about a Los Angeles transit worker who had worked at the job every day until he was 101. And on his 101st birthday, his coworkers gave a huge party for him and he died the next day. That's compression of morbidity, and that's what I urge you all to work toward achieving. And how you do that is by learning and applying the principles of healthy living, by learning and as early in life trying to make corrections in how you eat, in how you exercise, and how you handle stress in all of this. And also, I think the economic consequences of this are also profound. If we are going to, if this huge population of old people that we are going to experience in all of our societies does not begin to adopt the strategies that lead to compression of morbidity, then the additional burden on already strained healthcare systems is unsupportable. On the other hand, if we can incentivize people to begin to work toward compression of morbidity, then the consequence of having this demographic change are much less. So those are the main messages that I want to leave you with. I hope you have some sense of what integrative medicine is. I want you to hear again my very firm conviction that this is the future of medicine. I also firmly believe that this is a solution, or a big part of the solution, of the healthcare crisis that's going to affect all of us. And again, I emphasize to you that I think India is in a very special position, potentially, to be the place where new models of medicine, of healthcare delivery can be developed that can be replicated around the world. Thank you.